All right, last week we nearly finished lesson 5. There's a list of about 13 things that Josh mentioned as reasons why we should not accept theistic evolution. Of course, the point of lesson 5 is focusing on organic evolution. Lesson 4 was inorganic evolution. And he goes through several of these. We talked about these last week, and then the second half of that is that plants and animals were created fully mature. The fact that they weren't created as infants, they weren't created as seeds, they were created fully mature, full grown, and thus they bore offspring of their own kind. And that they didn't bear offspring and then create whole new species. In fact, I just read or saw an article saying a whole new species of something has been discovered from something or other, and it was just a variation of the species. It wasn't a new species. It was just they had a different color fur or something like that. It wasn't anything new. It was just a variation. But they called it a new species. It isn't. It's a subspecies. It's a variation. The fact that Adam was the first human, as opposed, of course, to evolution, there's a whole lot of precedents that came before Adam that kind of led up to Homo sapiens as we know them. Yet God tells us Adam was the first human. Woman was created from man. Woman didn't evolve side by side with man. She was created from man. And then perhaps the most poignant point on this list is this 12th one, which is that God ceased from his work. And if scientists are claiming that evolution continues, and yet the Bible says that God rested, in fact, the entire point of the idea of the Sabbath day is that on the seventh day God rested. And the Hebrew writer comes up in Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4, emphasizing that rest that still exists. And within that, there is a passage of Scripture specifically in Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 3, where the Hebrew writer says, "We who have believed do enter that rest, as he has said, so I swore in my wrath they shall not enter my rest, although the works were finished from the foundation of the world." Now, the works being finished would be the creation, of all things. If those works haven't been finished, then everything we're told in the Bible is a lie. And so what's the point of believing anything? And so the fact that the works are finished, and again, this is from a perspective of people who claim to believe in God, may have started everything, maybe got the top spinning, but then allowed billions of years to progress. But then Hebrews chapter 4, verse 4, he has spoken in a certain place of the seventh day in this way. God rested on the seventh day from all his works. Not all the works that he would do, like miracles and things like that, but as it pertained to creation, he finished all his works. But if this is true, he hasn't. And so to me, that's a very poignant example to bring up. And then the last one he brings up is that all animals were created to be herbivores. And I thought that was really interesting. I actually hadn't caught that before in Genesis chapter 1. And of course, we notice Adam and Eve and how that they were given the fruit of the garden to eat and so forth. But God specifically says for his animals as well, that they were given those things to eat. And I thought that was really interesting. I hadn't really caught that specific detail before. And the reason he brings that out is because a lot of the ways that paleontologists and so forth, they determine whether a species was an herbivore or carnivore is based on the shape of teeth. And if they have sharp incisors and things like that, they assume they were carnivores or meat eaters. And one of the points that Josh brings out is that there are animals that exist that have those types of teeth that are exclusively herbivores. Some still have sharp teeth, like fruit bats, giant pandas. They still have those sharp teeth, and if they were to be found, say, paleontologically, in paleontology, they would look at that skull, look at those teeth, and say, well, this must have been a carnivore. When in fact, no, they're herbivores. So I thought that was really interesting. I don't know if that changed when Adam and Eve were cast out of the garden, because obviously some things changed then, because they weren't allowed back in the garden. Man had to till the ground, so maybe the animals started becoming more omnivorish maybe in some ways after that. Maybe it was after the flood that they became more omnivorish and had exclusive carnivores and things like that. I don't know when that changed. but it sounds like originally they were meant to be herbivores. All right. But again, that goes back to adaptation, right? You adapt to your surroundings, you adapt to what needs you have, what needs you don't have. That's, again, within that micro-evolutionary component. Okay, we adapt to our surroundings. And so if you don't have a lot of fruits and veggies to be able to eat, you adapt to something else. And that's all that shows. They didn't evolve to eat meat. They just adapted. All right. Thoughts or comments through that? All right, let's cover our questions then for lesson 5. True or false? Few religious groups teach theistic evolution today. False. Yeah, one of the first points he brings out is that the Roman Catholic Church has begun to teach and embrace this, as well as several other denominations, I guess you could say, or regions of churches and religions. They've begun to teach that, again, trying to... Honestly, personally, I don't think it has anything to do with conviction at all. It has everything to do with wanting to be on the same page with mainstream society. They don't want to lose members, lose people, and so they're trying to adapt to society so they don't have people telling them how ridiculous they are, how ignorant they are. So they're trying to kind of play both sides of the field to still be able to be relevant in society. It's probably the main motivation for doing that.
If you add God into anything, that makes it right.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So add God into evolution, that makes it okay. Yeah. They're doing the same thing with abortion. You know, I mentioned that Jewish rabbi who was trying to make the case from the Old Testament that the Old Testament taught that it would be sinful not to get an abortion if there was, like, the mother's life was in danger, which was a complete absurdity from the text that he was using. Made no sense whatsoever. Question 2. No one who claims to be a member of the Church of Christ teaches theistic evolution. False. Yeah, there's, of course, the denominational, quote-unquote, Church of Christ. Remember, Church of Christ is supposed to be a descriptive term, not a label, not something that you attach on the sign that makes your church okay. There's a lot of churches, quote-unquote, churches of Christ, that are no different than a Baptist church or a community church or a denominational church. There's just no difference. It's all about, yes, the name is important because it needs to be part of what the Bible describes. Okay, the church of the firstborn in Hebrews chapter 12. The way would be another one, the way in Acts. The church of God would be one. Churches of Christ, Romans 16. But it's about what we teach, what we practice. It's supposed to be describing the body of Christ and what it's doing. And yeah, that was false. Number 3, theistic evolutionists garner no support from either the most dedicated humanists or the strictest theologians. Okay, you could put true or false here. True, false because technically the chapter says theistic evolutionists garner no respect. Now, respect and support are basically the same thing. So I didn't know if Josh was trying to pull a fast one there, but the actual term that was used in the chapter regarding that point is that they garner no respect. But to me, respect and support are basically the same thing. So if you put true, that's fine. If you put false, and you, like I did, I crossed out support and put in respect instead, just to make a note that that was the only difference. Number 4, the Bible teaches that the first plants and animals were created in an infantile state and then later grew to maturity. False. Number 5, Elisha rebuked the children of Israel for their vacillating spirit and said, "How long will you go limping between two opinions?" False. Yeah, it was Elijah, not Elisha. See, that's what I mean by Josh pulling some fast ones. These have been questions that he's put in here that have been very detail-oriented, where if you didn't catch that one little detail, it'd kind of trick you. All right, multiple choice. Question 1. The idea that billions of years transpired between Genesis 1 and 2 is commonly called what? B, the gap hypothesis. Number 2, the idea that each day in the Genesis count of creation represents long eons of time. Day age, letter A, day age hypothesis. Number 3, the idea that Genesis 1 presents a symbolic set of events whereby the world was created with no respect to time or order is commonly called C, framework hypothesis. What event, number 4, from Genesis 3 did we state that some evolutionists interpret symbolically rather than literally? Technically, you could go with all of the above because the way the way the lesson is shown, every single one of those things would have to be interpreted symbolically. But the specific example that Josh brings out was D, that the serpent tempted Eve. That the example was that it wasn't a real serpent in the garden. It was allegorical for the sense of evil and that sort of thing. Whereas we believe it was a literal serpent in the garden. So technically it could be all of the above, because again, all of them would be interpreted allegorically under that type of a framework. But the specific example was D. Number 5, theistic evolution teaches that the stars were created billions of years ahead of the earth. However, the Bible teaches the earth was created on day 1. The stars were created on B, 4. All right, number 6, popular influential media outlets that often teach evolution include? Yes, all of the above. It isn't one or the other. You go through and you read that one specific section, he mentions all 4 of those in that section that have at some point listed articles or did something that taught macroevolution. Okay. Short answer, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these because, again, there's some variation depending on how you answered these, but explain the difference between organic and inorganic theistic evolution. Talk about how organic are those things that are alive, but those who believe in organic also believe that God allowed the worlds and everything, the earth, the sun, all that to also, that's full-on evolution, just saying God started it, basically. Inorganic is that God created all living beings the way the Bible says he does, but not the earth, not the sun, the universe, and all that. That took 4.5 billion years or whatever. Is either idea supported by the Bible? No. Number 2, name some passages outside the book of Genesis that show that the chronology of creation account in Genesis is taken literally, not figuratively. Exodus 20 with the institution of the Sabbath day. Mark chapter 10, which is a passage that was used last chapter regarding Jesus, referring to since the creation, God created man and female. Hebrews chapter 4, like I mentioned, regarding how that God has rested from his works, and since the foundation of the world, these works have been finished. There's several different places you could go to acknowledge that it isn't just Moses who says this. The fact that Jesus himself references this, well, either Jesus was wrong, and if Jesus is wrong, then, what's the point of our faith? But if Jesus is right, then that means these things actually happened. And the fact that they happened through Jesus, remember John chapter 1, all things that were made through him and by him. All right, let's see, number 3. If one of the events from Genesis listed in multiple choice question number 4 above is interpreted figuratively, is there anything to prevent an individual from interpreting the other 4 events figuratively? No. And that goes back to that serpent tempted Eve. Okay, that's the question he's referring to. Every single one of those events would have to be interpreted figuratively if you interpret any one of those other things that took place, creation or anything else figuratively. Question 4, if God created the world through billions of years of evolution, which the evolutionist says continues, would God be finished with his work? No. We just talked about scriptures that have a bearing upon this question. Jesus would be wrong, Mark 10. The Hebrew writer would have absolutely no point in Hebrews 4, verses 3 and 4, yet he says he's done with it. Question 5, what verse of the New Testament tells us to beware of science falsely so-called? That's King James Version. 1 Timothy 6, verse 20. The term there is gnosis, which means knowledge. In fact, most translations, the newer translations have knowledge falsely so-called, or that which is falsely called knowledge. But of course, science promotes or proclaims to have knowledge of how things work in the natural world. That's what science is all about. And so that's why the King James translated it as science falsely so-called. Question 6. Do you believe these last 2 lessons might be helpful for a theistic evolution?
Have a good honest heart.
See, that to me, that's what it would depend upon, right? Here's the issue that I have. I put as a rule, no. And the reason for that is most likely they've already considered these things, but they made a conscious decision to try to have 1 foot in the scientific realm and 1 foot in the religious realm. And as a result, they've compromised their heart and they've compromised their faith. That's a willful choice that they've made. Now, again, it goes back to, though, are they having some crisis of conscience here? Do they feel guilty that they've done this? If there's some element of that, then maybe it would have an impact. And it may be that some of these individuals have been taught this growing up, and so maybe they've never considered, or at least maybe seriously considered, the specific points and in the end, a lot of times people take, especially evolutionists, they take things piecemeal rather than letting things, what would the logical conclusion of this be? What would the end result of this be? If you put all these things together, you don't see how that end result then sounds ridiculous. And so, again, as Nolan mentioned, if it's an honest heart, and one who truly does believe in God, and they're truly wanting to seek the truth, then yeah, it might have an impact. Paul, who really truly sought to do the will of God, and thought he was doing the will of God until the road to Damascus.
He has noted all along some who believed one thing and did come around, or at least partway come around. So
Yeah, absolutely. And he pointed out evolutionists who then gradually, as they looked into this stuff, began to disprove their own theories. And begin to realize that what the Bible says, is right on this or right on that. Doesn't mean necessarily that they became Christians, quote unquote, but that they changed their viewpoints based on the facts. All right. So lesson 6. Lesson 6 deals with two main, and this is lesson 6 is where you start getting into some of the nitty-gritty issues that are never described, especially like for me in my biology classes and things like that in high school and in college. These things weren't discussed or described in public school. And these are some of the things because they're kind of the dirty little secrets specifically of the evolutionary side of things. He's going to talk about two specific Darwinian dogmas that have been proven to be a false narrative, basically. He mentions the fact that microevolution is not firmly planted on a bedrock of irrefutable ideas, as its proponents would lead us to believe. When we talk about macroevolution and there's any kind of doubt expressed, people scoff. I know my kids in some of their classes at biology, their teachers teacher has implied that if you don't believe this, then you're ignorant or, back-minded, and that sort of backwater type of redneck mind. You don't understand the truth, you don't understand the facts. But the fact of the matter is, these things are not irrefutable. Fortunately, many have discovered, and I thought this was an interesting thing that Josh pointed out here, that supporters of naturalism will go to almost any length, even deception, to defend their cause. Not necessarily attached to evolution, but attached to other narrative things like climate change and things like that. Not to say the climate's not changing, but regarding the origins of that, a couple of years ago, there was a report that was done up regarding carbon dioxide and its effect on the environment. And because that report showed carbon dioxide has a lesser impact than previously believed, it was buried and not released. And for years it was buried and not released because it had a direct opposite narrative than what had been taught. That carbon dioxide has a terrible impact on the environment, and yet this shows that it doesn't have that big or that much, as much as they were saying that it did. And so this one example where you kind of cherry pick certain things or you bury certain facts to make your narrative, support your narrative to make it sound better than what it actually is. This quote by Michael Bay, he admits the Darwinists have a lot of good psychological tricks at their disposal. And another one that I thought in particular, because this is coming from an evolutionist, this is not a religious person, this isn't a religious apologist, Dr. Henry Lipson of the University of Manchester, notice his credentials. He's head of the Department of Physics, he's fellow of the Royal Society. He said evolution became in a sense a scientific religion. Almost all scientists have accepted it. And notice this, many are prepared to bend their observations to fit with it. To me, that the very idea or ideal of the pursuit of science, okay, follow the science is the phrase everybody's saying, is to follow facts, okay? But when you're willing to bend your observations or to bury certain things that defeat a narrative, is that science? That's government. That's trying to frame something in a way to make you believe something that isn't based on or isn't supported by all of the facts. I mean, anybody can cherry pick facts from anything and make it support a narrative. But you take all the facts together. You don't bury them. You don't sugarcoat anything. And to me, the fact that he admits, and he's an evolutionist, He admits that some are prepared to bend their observations to fit with that narrative. That tells me they're not real scientists. And individuals who are willing to do that, they're not real scientists because they're following what people want them to say or want them to be able to prove, not what the science actually says, or facts actually say. So one of the points, the first point that he brings up, remember he said there's going to be two that he's going to address in this chapter. The first one is that gradual changes don't accumulate into complex biological systems. This is the discussion of reducible complexity versus irreducible complexity. And the whole thought process here is that macroevolution is based upon, even within a single cell organism, there are so many different functions within that single cell organism that if you were to take that one function out, the rest of it could not function the way it should. Okay, they're all interdependent upon each other. The idea is that macroevolution says that if it can be gradual, okay, these systems start coming in gradually, whether they're all together or one at a time, and they can still function, then that should prove macroevolution. Darwin even admitted that for macroevolution to have occurred, biological systems must be reducibly and not irreducibly complex. And the reason for that is, if they're irreducibly complex, meaning you cannot reduce the function of something or take that function out, and this mechanism continue to exist or function the way it should, that means that billions of years or millions of years couldn't have led to its being created. Okay, it means that all at once it would all have to pop into existence at the same time in order for it to work. He stated, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Now, at the time, they didn't have a lot of the technology and the ability to look at microscopic things, so forth, that he did at that time. But we do. And there are plenty of examples and evidences to show that irreducibly complex systems exist within living organisms. And this is defined, living biological or biochemical systems that are so inextricably reliant upon all their interdependent components that removing even one essential piece creates a total meltdown of the mechanism, renders the system useless. That's the definition for irreducibly complex. You cannot reduce it, okay? Therefore, if you can show irreducible complex systems in biological beings, you and me, or animals, or even a single cell organism, then macroevolution has a serious issue. Because it basically is stating something just popped into existence all at the same time to make this work. And I thought one of the great quotes, and there's lots of scriptures that Josh included in here. In fact, within this text that he's talking about this, he mentioned David in Psalms talking about how we're beautifully and wonderfully created or wonderfully made. But Ecclesiastes 11 and verse 5 is a very pointed verse for this particular topic. Solomon says, as you do not know what is the way of the wind, or how the bones grow in the womb of her who is with child, so you do not know the works of God who makes everything. And to me, it shows both the fact that we have to accept we don't and can't know all the details behind creation and how God did what he did, for one thing. Job is another chapter that bears that out, or a book rather, but also the fact that it should inspire within us not questionings and doubt, but rather awe and thankfulness that our God is so powerful and so all-knowing that he's able to create these things and put them in place, and it governs our world, it governs nature. These laws that exist, they're there for a reason. They're there for our benefit so that we can survive here. He did all this for you and for me. And so I thought Ecclesiastes 11 verse 5 was an excellent verse. All right, thoughts or comments through that? All right, he brings up several examples of, first of all, of inorganic machines where this is true. The internal combustion engine. He makes an excellent point where even some of the smallest components to an internal combustion engine, if you remove them, yeah, you may be able to sputter and putt to the nearest mechanic, but will that system continue to function indefinitely? No.
Is it going to get better?
Is it going to get better? Is it going to heal itself? No. Will evolution take care of it and create a new head gasket? No, that's not going to happen. And so if you remove even some of the smallest details of an internal combustion engine, it's not going to operate, first of all, efficiently. And that's the other thing about macroevolution. For a long time, macroevolutionists said that evolution evolves in a linear way to be more efficient. Well, now they're backtracking on that and saying, well, sometimes it'll go 2 steps forward, then 1 step back. Why? Why would it do that? That doesn't make any sense at all. So it goes from a more efficient version to a less efficient version. And that's
The law of entropy just continues to make it go down.
the law of entropy. Yep, law of entropy. He brings up the example of the mousetrap. There's only like 5 components in a mousetrap, a basic mousetrap. And if you take any one of those out, does it still work? No. The human eye, and if you read through that list of the process that the eye takes, so as soon as it receives a light signal, and it happens like that, I mean quicker than that, it happens in nanoseconds, that we're able, when I look to you and then I look to Joe, and then I look back, I can see that blue-green shirt and I can see the peach shirt. Okay, the fact that I can interpret that in just nanoseconds shows, and he even points out, if any one of those processes breaks down or takes longer than it should, what results? In fact, the end, I love Josh's sense of humor. He has such a sarcasm. The end results are what? Blinding. Yeah, the end results are blinding. Okay, your eyes aren't going to work the way they should. He brings up bacterial flagellum, and if you've ever looked up, and you should, flagellum are interesting. They're a little interesting. Basically, it's like a propeller on a boat. Okay, the way they work, or a propeller on a plane, but they're even more efficient on flagellum than they are that we've created. And he even likens it to an internal combustion engine. There's several components within the bacterial flagellum that are very similar to our engines. They'll make our engines go. But the difference is flagellum don't need to be filled up with gasoline all the time. They use acid to create an internal electricity. And acid flowing over the membranes generates electricity, which is just awesome. It's amazing. And he points out that if you take any one of those parts out that makes the flagellum do what it doesn't work. Blood clotting, so there's a whole list of things. He doesn't go into detail about these, but blood clotting, lobster eyes that have square reflecting geometry, which would be just awesome to see through their eyes for a minute. Cellular transport, which is to say, moving energy within the cell from one thing to the next. Mechanism of antibodies and antigens, the way antibodies move to a certain place in the body to fight against infection, or when you have a scar for it to heal. The human knee joint, he says there's 15 plus irreducibly complex parts to make the knee joint, something as simple as a knee joint, function the way it should. And if you take any one of those parts out, what do you end up having? Surgery or knee replacement. Okay, you can't walk. All right. And to me, those are excellent. Those are all, and again, that's not a comprehensive list by any means of all the different irreducible systems that are in existence in nature. Thoughts or comments of that? All right, the very next section, there's a whole list of quotes from some of these. These are evolutionists. Remember, these aren't religious defendists or apologists. These are evolutionists. But the one that stood out to me the most was this quote by Margulis: "New mutations don't create new species, they create offspring that are impaired." And I thought that was, first of all, I laughed out loud when I read that, but then secondly, it made me consider the fact that one of the core elements of Darwinism is that mutations generate new species. And the point that this evolutionist said is new mutations don't create new species, it creates a child that isn't going to be able to function, or it isn't going to be able to survive. And as a general rule, most mutations do not end up going forward if they don't help a offspring adapt to its environment. Okay, if it's going to be something that's going to actually be a detriment to survival, then they're just going to die off. It's not going to be something that continues. So that I thought that was a really important, really interesting, that mutation, random chance and random mutation kind of being the core engine behind macroevolution. And yet, at least this evolutionist acknowledges that's not how that works. That doesn't create new species. It just creates offspring that are impaired. All right, so then the second Darwinian dogma that he addresses is radiocarbon radiometric dating. And this is really interesting stuff, and you start getting into the methods of dating and the decay rates of different particles and so forth. But he starts off with talking about carbon-14. Okay, carbon-14 can only be done with mainly organic things, although there's carbon in just about everything. But it only has a certain half-life. There's only a certain max amount of time that you can utilize the measuring of carbon. It can only attempt to provide ranges in thousands of years, not millions. In fact, one scientist was quoted as saying 40,000 years is the max. So then what they do is, scientists have in their mind a certain spectrum or a certain timeline where they think this is going to fit. Then they measure the radiocarbon dating, and then they try to narrow in on 1.5 million or 1.6 million or 2.5 million, whatever it may be. It's not that radiocarbon is actually saying it's 2 million years old, because it can't. It only lasts for about 40,000 years. So they already have a preconceived narrative in their mind as to where in the timeline this can possibly fit. Then they stick it in there, basically. And so it's really not based on any actual fact. And what's interesting is coal and diamonds, both of which were supposedly crafted and created over millions and millions of years, what has been found in them? Carbon. Well, carbon shouldn't be found in them if they're millions and millions of years old, because carbon only lasts for 40,000 years from the time that it's created or generated within that particular thing, like coal or diamond. There's only 40,000 years. After that, you shouldn't be able to find any. And yet, coal and diamonds have been found with carbon-14. He says, in fact, there's a list, and I hope, and I don't know if we will or not, have time to look at some of the stuff he includes in the kind of the index at the end. But there's a whole lot of stuff that he has, like detailed information, and he cites one of the ones where he's got a list of 90 ancient geological samples that had been supposedly dated by scientists as millions of years old, yet they have carbon-14 that's been found in it. And because it has carbon-14, they can't explain why it has carbon-14. They just know it has to be millions of years old, and some process we don't understand must have preserved the carbon. Well, if that's the case, then how can you count on anything to date it? If you can acknowledge and say, well, obviously carbon can be preserved, well, then you can't count on carbon for any dating whatsoever, can you? And the same is true for any dating method. That if you're saying that there's environmental conditions that can cause misdating, then how can you count on any of it? That's why that leads us to the uranium becoming lead. And he talks about the uranium radiometric dating. He says within this there are 3 unknowns that must be assumed. So uranium-238 will eventually decay to the point it becomes lead-206. And based upon that, they claim that they can date certain things. But there's 3 assumptions that they make. The first one is that when uranium was formed, no lead was already there. So they're assuming in whatever it is that they're dating, no lead existed at the time that it was created, only the uranium-238. Because if there was any lead, that completely messes up the whole timeline. It's also assumed that neither uranium nor lead has decreased in mass over time, despite the fact that evidence has shown over time these particles, these elements will migrate into other things around them as well from whatever the first thing had. It'll kind of bleed out into other things over time. So you're assuming that the mass has stayed the same when evidence shows that that's not always true. And then it's also assumed that decay rates have remained constant over time. And to me, this is a big one, because you cannot, and all 3 of these things cannot be proven. You cannot prove with absolute certainty that any of these things, but in particular, given the changes that have taken place on our Earth, given the fact of the flood and all the different geological changes that took place with the flood, to me, it's almost more unlikely that decay rates have stayed the same as opposed to likely. Now, even if they were the same, that wouldn't change anything. Can God create an element to be 4 million years old? Sure, I have no problem with that. But you're still assuming that no environmental events or solar flares or whatever can't impact the decay rates. And that's absolutely not true. In fact, there's evidence that suggests that that's not the case. That decay rates can fluctuate over time, depending on what they're exposed to. All right. The only thing you can determine, he says, is the concentration of whatever element it is. You can't use it reliably as to determine age. But you don't ever hear that at all, ever, from biology class and that sort of thing. He gives several examples. Wood from Australia that was dated to 45,000 years, not 45 million years. The most interesting one was the Mount St. Helens. Most of us were alive. I wasn't. I was 2 years old when Mount St. Helens erupted. But the lava dome that was created there, okay, they did this was what, I guess it was only 11 years old, so that was 97 at the time that they dated it, but it dated to either a half, that's 500,000, or 3 million years. But it was only created in 1986. And of course, I don't know all the details and all the facts behind it, but I can see somebody arguing, well, yeah, but the magma that existed was, 3 million years ago. But then scientists will be quick to point out, no, there's a molecular change that takes place between the magma hitting oxygen, becoming lava. That's what we call it, lava. Magma and lava is underground, above ground. Then the other one is 8 dinosaur bones that have been found that have carbon-14 in them. First of all, the fact that dinosaur bones have been found, yet they were wiped out supposedly 66 million years ago, tells us what? It wasn't 66 million years ago. But second of all, they were dated between 22 and 39,000 years. And again, that's assuming that carbon hasn't changed in its decay rate over time. So, and remember, just here recently, they've been talking about some of these dinosaur bones they found that had bone marrow, that was still soft, that they could test and look at. Some that still had, some kind of tissue that it still had, and they couldn't believe that it still had tissue. As if it died just a couple hundred years ago. It still has tissue on it. Well, imagine that. All right, thoughts or comments through that? All right, we'll stop there. The second bell's about to ring, so we finished our lesson. We will pick up on our questions for lesson 6 next week and cover lesson 7. Thank you, everybody.